Good morning, respected teachers and my dear colleagues. So today we are discussing part 2 of the CCR. The part 1 was discussed last Wednesday of a 41-year-old female with vision loss. Today we will be discussing the therapeutic challenges. On one fine day, we received a call for a bedside PSC by the oncosurgery resident for a patient who was posted for pneumonectomy. As we went there, we saw that the patient was highly irritable, unwilling to communicate, not opening eyes. Hence, we asked the husband about the situation, and he told that there has been a recent increased severe headache and deterioration of vision and recent aggravation of difficulty in breathing. Her vitals were of heart rate of 138, blood pressure of 180 by 98, respiratory rate of 28 and saturation of 92 with drooping of right eyelids and reduced air entry in the left lung. As such, we advised for a proper evaluation to maintain her vitals to optimize her and for an urgent neurological assessment and consultation. By now we know that this was a phase of pituitary apoplexy of the patient that she was having, and she was shifted to the ICU. She was medically managed, and fortunately after 4 days of medical management she was optimized, and then a multidisciplinary meeting was organized to discuss her plan of treatment and strategies, and a unanimous decision was made that the patient is having a provisional diagnosis of GHRH secreting left bronchial carcinoid with pituitary hyperplasia, and the patient should be operated for left pneumonectomy. On that note, we were called for a second PSC visit where we found that the patient having diminished vision, headache, coarsening of facial features and shortening of breath, which was increased on exertion, which was progressive. This patient was a known case of diabetes mellitus since 4 months on oral anti-diabetic drugs but poorly controlled. Hence, in ICU, after stabilization, she was shifted to IV insulin as per sliding scale, and she was also on octreotide and hydrocort for her medical management. The other histories were non-significant, and her general examination now was much better. Her vitals were stable and BMI was 27. She was conscious and communicating now. She had acromegalic features of facial features with prominent supraorbital ridge, widened nose, depressed nasal bridge and thickened lips, and examination of systemic revealed absent air entries in left lung. Her preoperative investigations were not significant. They were within normal limits. Only the blood sugar HbA1c was 10.5, which was recently diagnosed, and she could lift 1.5 poles in spirometry. Airway assessment for us was significant as she had a BMI more than 25. There were buck teeth and significant macroglossia was present, and hence the modified null empathy grading was 3. Bronchoscopy done by the chest and TB department revealed edematous carina, and anticipated difficult laryngoscopy and intubation was suggested. Her X-ray had complete opacification of the left hemithorax. CT was suggestive of a huge mass which was encasing the vessels and aborting the aortic arch. Hence, a suspicion of high risk of bleeding was made. So I asked the residents on this note that what workup could be done to evaluate her cardiac and respiratory reserve of this patient who is posted for pneumonectomy. Any resident, please? Okay, so we have a 3-leg pre-thoracotomy assessment. The PFT was done for this patient which suggested significant reduced FEV1, which was less than 41% predicted, which is a more sensitive indicator. The exercise saturation was had fallen from 97 to 93, which was significant, and her lung function suggested a post-operative FEV1 which was less than 40%, which is very less. Hence a VQ scan was suggestive, which told that the right lung is having preserved perfusion which will not be removed. Hence, on this basis, we were able to chalk out our plan for the surgery. On this note, a departmental board meeting was organized where we discussed the plans and strategies, the pros and cons, and the challenges we would be facing and how we would be dealing with the challenges, which we jotted down on a triad because the patient is having a neuroendocrine tumor with surgery of pneumonectomy and she had a recent pituitary apoplexy. On that note, we know that this neuroendocrine tumor is involved with spells of hemodynamic variations, excess risk of bronchospasm because of the histamine and serotonin-like peptides released. Hence, we would be avoiding triggers at all steps. Physiological triggers like anxiety, pain of anesthesia, hypercapnia, blood pressure fluctuations which are obvious, mechanical triggers like tracheal intubation, extubation, tumor handling, and pharmacological drugs. Not only this, the risk of the pneumonectomy itself is a high-risk surgery, and it has different airway concerns, lung isolation techniques, one-lung ventilation strategies, and challenges of lateral positioning, prolonged surgery, and the challenge of on-table extubation, and the risk of post-operative pulmonary complications in the post-operative period. Also, we would be dealing with brain protection strategies and strict intracoronary pressure control. Now, I invite Dr. Deepak for telling us the evaluation on surgical point of view.
Thank you, Dr. Pooja. Good morning, respected faculty. We will be talking about the surgical aspect of this patient. When the first call given to the oncosurgeon, patient was having performance status of 2 or 3. She was having uncontrolled diabetes mellitus on high dose of steroids, suffering from pituitary apoplexy, having raised intracranial pressure, vision loss, poor effort tolerance, and having only one functional lung. Then what to do? This is the high-risk situation, having significant amount of symptomatology. So, suspecting pulmonary carcinoid, next steps have been taken. Preoperative workup from surgeon's point of view was done. The risk assessment in pulmonary and cardiac risk has been done. Risk reduction has been done with chest physiotherapy and lower the dosage of steroids. Preoperative workup was done which suggestive of FEV1 values of 41%, 1.06 liters of perfusion with VQ scan suggestive of no perfusion in left lung. Her exercise tolerance was low. Her cardiac evaluation turned out to be normal. Some American College of Chest and Physicians has guidelines which says that stepwise evaluation of patient has to be done for classifying patient into high risk, moderate risk, and the low risk. According to these guidelines, our patient lands up in the high risk category. The same guidelines has been suggested by British Thoracic Society, which also classify the patient according to the evaluation. In these from these guidelines also, our patient lined up in the high risk group. So some evaluation has to be done in view of surgery, that bronchoscopy, CECT thorax, PET CT whole body, which was suggestive of locoregional disease, and biopsy which was done prior, which was suggestive of grade 1 neuroendocrine tumor. Bronchoscopy suggestive of no intraluminal growth. The extrinsic compression at around 1 cm from carina on left side is seen. CT images also suggestive of same, that there is encasement of descending thoracic aorta, then there is complete encasement of pulmonary left pulmonary arteries, and there is huge around 1 cm subcarinal lymph node is seen. This
complete encasement of descending aorta?
No, sorry sir, more than 180 degrees sir. Yes sir, yes sir. So prior to surgery, plan was for left carinal pneumonectomy and will be decided on intraoperative finding. In our patient, we might land up doing the type B left carinal pneumonectomy. Some studies have revealed that which significant amount 5 to 10% of mortality has been there in all these case series, which having minimum 200 patients of pneumonectomy. So plan was for left pneumonectomy with lymph nodal sampling under high risk.
Why do you call it as a carcinoid rather than carcinoma? What is the difference in a carcinoid and carcinoma? I want to know the basic difference.
Carcinoid tumors are neuroendocrine tumors which secrete the peptides, amines, and they are functional. Carcinoma is from epithelial tissue, sir. So that is called carcinoma. And
endocrines are also from epithelial.
Yes, sir.
Sure, what is the difference, basic difference?
They are functional tumors, sir. They secrete the amines, peptides. Neuroendocrine tumors are secretory tumors, sir. They are having some hormonal functions which, like they secrete amines like serotonin, peptides like then serotonin. Sorry, sir.
Sir, as per the new classification, we don't call them carcinoids or carcinomas anymore. We call them neuroendocrine tumors, and then we grade them low risk, low grade, intermediate risk, and high risk as per the number of mitosis seen and the Ki67, which is a proliferative marker. So Neha, you want to comment current classification?
All over the body wherever neuroendocrine origin is there, we call them as neuroendocrine carcinomas. But in the recent WHO, we have retained the word carcinoid for lungs. For lungs, we are using typical carcinoid, atypical carcinoids, and the well-differentiated neuroendocrine tumors grade 3 are not been included in lung cancers. Otherwise, we are using it as neuroendocrine tumors only. So we can use neuroendocrine tumor as a name also, as well as carcinoid for lung only. And neuroendocrine is and carcinomas basically both are epithelial origin only, but neuroendocrine are secreting tumors and their origin is from nervous system basically.
Neurons. Metastasis. Yes.
We cannot call them as benign or malignant. It has a potential for it.
Live carcinomas.
They don't behave as aggressively as carcinomas. That is why initially they will call it carcinoids. But as Dr. Hemant pointed out, now the new terminology is that we call them neuroendocrine neoplasms. The grade 1, grade 2, grade 3 are neuroendocrine tumors, and then there is neuroendocrine carcinoma.
Shall I start? So, as I discussed that there are a triad of challenges that we would be facing, on that note we prepared our OT for all the emergency drugs, and difficult airway cart was ready 1 day prior to the surgery. On arrival, the checklist was done, multi-parameter monitoring was attached, basic hemodynamics, 2 large IV bore lines were attached, and as we know that this patient is prone for hemodynamic fluctuations, so we took the epidurals, arterial and central venous under local anesthesia, and we've used invasive arterial monitoring, flow track for invasive cardiac output monitoring, central venous pressure for fluids, hourly urine output was assessed, and adequate depth of anesthesia was assessed by bispectral index. Strain of 4 guard was used for neuromuscular monitoring, core temperatures because the surgery is of long duration, serial blood glucose as patient is diabetic, and end-tidal CO2s and arterial blood gas samples were taken at early intervals. So my question to the residents, can anyone suggest the choice of anesthesia that we would have used for this patient who is posted for pneumonectomy with bronchial carcinoid and pituitary apoplexy in the past? So we used a hybrid approach, that is a combination of general with one lung ventilation with segmental thoracic epidural. The thoracic epidural reduces the sympathetic response to the vasoactive agents released during carcinoid manipulation, and it is not only used for the post-operative pain management, but it also reduces the intraoperative anesthesia drugs, and hence it hastens early recovery from the anesthesia. It was used in sitting position, and we avoided stressors like pain which could have created a crisis, and fortunately the risk of neuraxial anesthesia induced hypertension, triggering mediator release and carcinoid crisis was not encountered. We pre-oxygenated the patient after epidural, and adequate pre-medication was given to alleviate the anxiety, and smooth anesthesia techniques were used, and all the drugs that could create histamine release were avoided, and patient was kept in deep plane of anesthesia because the primary objective is to provide stable and controlled conditions, avoiding any stimulatory factors. The airway management for this patient is different. Normally we use a single lumen tube, but here we need to collapse the operated lung and ventilate the other lung. So we use a double lumen tube. There are usually 2 types of double lumen tubes. The left is ideally used for both the surgeries, it is less challenging, but here as the tumor is the bronchial stump has to be cut, so the left tube will interfere with the cutting of the bronchial stump, and it would directly stimulate the tumoral hormonal release. Hence we use a more difficult placement of right double lumen tube. It's more difficult because the right upper lobe is at the more acute angulation, and hence placement of the cuff at the right position is challenging. It should neither be too far out nor should be too far in. This is aided with the help of fiber optic bronchoscope, which correctly places the ventilation, confirms the ventilation of right upper lobe, and this cuff confirms the adequate positioning. Okay, sir. After the placement of double lumen tube, one lung ventilation protocol is essential because now we are ventilating only one lung. Hence a low tidal volume is necessary because we need to avoid any risk of barotrauma. When we do so, we are doing so at the cost of rise of VaCO2, but it's a solitary healthy lung, and even if the peak pressures are high, low tidal volume is necessary. Before incision, the W1 tube is confirmed after the position is made in the lateral position, and multimodal analgesia according to the enhanced recovery after surgery protocol was given, with paracetamol, dexamethasone and bolus of epidural was started. We secured our lines and body warmer was attached. Pressure point cases were taken in lateral positioning, and DVT prophylaxis was started, and we asked the surgeon to start the surgery. So I request the surgeon, Dr. Anand, to please mention the surgical details.
Dr. Pooja, one or two questions. One,
Yes,
the left lung is already collapsed.
Right, sir.
So why do you say that we want to give one lung anesthesia to collapse the left lung?
So the perfusion is not there in the left lung, but we can never say that there is no, it's not 100% perfusion absent. There are bronchial arteries which are always there. So definitely we will be using a one lung, because we don't want that bronchial supply to happen. So that's why we use one lung ventilation, and hence we use a W-min tube for that.
Second, for the sake of students, can you explain the differences between spinal anesthesia and epidural anesthesia?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
So when you go for thoracotomy for any kind of procedure, open procedure or wires, you need to collapse the operated lung because it is going to come in the way.
Yes, sir.
This is pneumonectomy, so you have to reach to the stem, it requires place. And if you have to do some regional procedure, for example, it could be lobectomy, then it is essential to keep it collapsed.
Yes, sir.
Right. And one more reason is that you need to prevent flooding of secretions from the diseased lung. Now the diseased lung may be having infection, may be having pus, may be having suppuration, may be having a high diastasis.
Right, sir.
So as a standard technique of airway management for thoracic surgery, and including these mediastinal procedures, esophagus and all, you use a technique of one lung anesthesia. Mostly it is W-min tube for adults, but in pediatric patients there are some challenges. There are other alternative techniques including endobronchial intubation and bronchial blockers. So
right, sir.
we will not discuss more here. The standard technique is W-min tube, left-sided. Here it was right-sided, you rightly chose.
Yes, sir.
And sir, one more important thing is immobility. Whenever we are ventilating both the lungs, the operating lung is also mobile and moving. Any surgery doing in moving lung is very, very difficult. So always surgeons want a stable thing to be operated on. So a stable operating field is provided with this one lung ventilation.
Yes, sir. So the epidural, as I mentioned, that the spinal goes into the subarachnoid space, and the epidural is in the epidural space, as the name suggests. So the spinal will have a motor blockade, or intense motor blockade. So the difference is when we insert the needle, the skin, supraspinous ligament, interspinous ligament, flavum, and then the epidural space comes, and if we puncture it more, then we receive a subarachnoid space. So the dosage of drugs used in the amount of drug that is used is different, and the activity is different. Here, as I said, that the segmental thoracic epidural is used. That means that the patient has had an epidural in the thoracic level, where we are blocking only those parts of thorax where the surgery is operated. So in the epidural space we give drug, and that can be a catheter is placed in situ, that through that catheter we give drugs even post-operatively for pain management. So the space location is different.
So in today's clinical practice, is there any place for spinal anesthesia today?
Yes, sir, definitely. We are using...
so where spinal and where epidural?
Yes, sir. We are using, even in MRM surgeries, we are using segmental spinal.
Gynecology there.
Most of the orthopedic surgeries, we use spinal. Spinal has not gone if epidural has come.
But basically, spinal anesthesia is for depth of anesthesia. Intraoperative surgical plane of anesthesia is provided by spinal anesthesia because it is in the CSF. The drug is in the CSF, encroaching a good amount of motor as well as sensory block. While epidural mostly is used for analgesia and reduction of stress responses. epidural space is not a potential space. We created a space between dura and ligamentum flavum, and it is filled with so many things, including fat and
Vessels
everything.
and lymphatic.
And you are not always definite that response will always come. While in the spinal case, in the spinal anesthesia, the drug is deposited in CSF. So naturally, the depth of anesthesia is quite good at that.
So even we use a combined approach of spinal and thoracic epidurals.
By accident, if you have gone into the spinal at T8, T9, then what will happen?
Sir, nowadays previously it was thought that you can't puncture dura at T8, T9 levels. But now with the advancement of medical and surgical things, we come to know now we are using even segmental subarachnoid blocks at the level of T4, T5. In our hospital also we are using MRM, and we have done one study also on that. And we are using MRM's breast surgery under thoracic spinal anesthesia, where we are depositing drug in T4 at the level of T5 levels. Right? So yes, we can do. We are doing that, and everyone is doing that in now.
Yes, sir.
Even all the drugs we can use.
Drugs are
Even
being used.
isobaric also, hyperbaric also, and there's a lots of modifications. Sir, anesthesia in modern time, the anesthesia has developed immensely. जितना सर्जरी एडवांस हुई है उससे कहीं ज्यादा anesthesia.
And even if there is a
सर्जरी एडवांस ही एनेस्थीसिया की वजह से हुई है.
We will calculate the p-value later. Okay.
Dr. Anand, please.
So the slides may depict the simplicity of the surgery, but trust me, it was not.
I'm surprised why the assistant professors are coming, not the residents from anesthesia and oncology.
Sir, actually this was being prepared for the last week thing, so that is why it is.
This was allotted to us for the last week.
I'm seeing second time assistant
We
professor.
felt that it is an important event. So we
Okay.
are
वो last Wednesday के हिसाब से तैयार किया था.
Exception, all right.
otherwise all rest 5 previous CPR for anesthesia department has been done by residents. And very well.
So a usual pneumonectomy is from skin to skin is 4 hours duration, blood loss of around 400 ml, 500 ml, and usually patient goes back home by day 3, day 4. But as you know, this is an unusual case. Already everybody has shown it is high risk case. We decided the patient was placed in right lateral decubitus position with arm in abducted position, and the usual incision for a thoracotomy is a 5th or 6th intercostal space. We used 5th because it was already a collapsed pleural cavity. The whole lung and diaphragm was moved up, and we used LD dividing because we needed more exposure. So intraoperatively there was no pleural disease, multiple adhesions between lung and rib cage, probably because it had been a long-standing non-functional lung, and there was a big mass of 15 by 10 centimeter at the hilum. Left pulmonary artery, as obviously since it's a hilar tumor, was encased by the tumor, and there was a large subcarinal node of around 3 by 2 centimeter, and area of contact to the aorta, descending thoracic aorta, was more than 180 degree. So just for the benefit of students, the hilum for a pneumonectomy, we need to divide 4 structures: main pulmonary artery of that side, superior pulmonary vein, inferior pulmonary vein, and the main bronchus. So this is the anterior view, which shows the left main PA, superior pulmonary vein, inferior pulmonary vein, and above all is the arch of aorta, and the left main bronchus comes below all these structures. So this is an AP view, this is an posterior. When you flip the lung anteriorly, this is the posterior view, this is the lateral view, and this is the posterior view. So when we go from anterior, the pulmonary veins followed by artery, then the bronchus is the sequence, and reverse is when we come from posterior to the anterior one. So surgical step is it was not standardized because we didn't knew it was an unconventional situation for us. So the mediastinal pleura was divided, inferior pulmonary ligament. I think inferior pulmonary vein was the easiest one to sacrifice first. So we sacrificed the inferior pulmonary vein, looped the left main PA. The left main PA has short stump compared to the right main PA. We had to take it intrapericardially because of the shortage of the stump. Then we took the superior pulmonary vein and then we dissected off the bronchus. The main challenge was the bronchus because of the disease which was infiltrating, as we could have seen in the scan, in the left main bronchus also. So we had dissected the subcarinal node first and then get as proximally as possible, because we wanted to avoid a sleeve resection, because patient was already very on high doses of steroids and there is very high risk of bronchopleural fistula. So this is the surgical bed which shows a descending thoracic. So this is a descending thoracic aorta which is going. This is the intercostal muscle flap which has been used to prevent post-operatively bronchopleural fistula. Then I think this is the pulmonary artery, left main PA, superior pulmonary vein, and this is the inferior pulmonary vein. And the subcarinal node was stuck to the esophagus and we had to take some muscular fibers also to take it, and it is not visible. The divided stump is not visible because it has been divided very close and it has retracted back. So next, for the intraoperative management by Dr.
Anand, how do you ensure during the division of the bronchus that you are not encroaching on the carina or the left or the right?
So left pneumonectomy is technically more challenging compared to the right, because left main bronchus is more shorter. Right main bronchus is more vertical, you get more length of it. So it is by palpation of, you have to see the carina, feel the carina after removing the subcarinal node. So we can fire the stapler. There are sleeve pneumonectomy, as we have shown, we can re-implant the right main bronchus into the main bronchus also. So no problem in firing carina as long as we have a 2 centimeter to 2.5 centimeter width. So before firing the stapler, we always ask the anesthetist to do an intraoperative broncho FOL kind of a thing, so that they can see how much we are compromising on the carina.
So whenever you are doing an organ dissection or a part of an organ dissection and you are dividing a branch of a vessel or an important structure, the most important thing intraoperatively is to make sure that you are not encroaching on what is going to remain with the patient. Of course, you have to do an oncologically complete resection, but you have to.
So, what one expects is different from what's the reality. This is the extensive intraoperative charting that we had done intraoperatively. The induction was started by 8:30 a.m. The thoracotomy started by 9:15, one lung by 9:20 and closed by 3:30. The duration was around 6 hours, and we were fortunate to extubate the patient after half an hour of closure with the help of all the monitoring aids, and we shifted after half an hour. The blood loss was 900 as expected. The urine was adequate. Judicious fluids were given. We had to transfuse 2 PRBCs and temperatures were adequate. So as we can see that the normal mean arterial blood pressures that we keep is around 80 and the heart rate also around 80. We had the blood pressures of mean arterial blood pressures going up to 110. Not only this, the heart rates, and even dipping up to less than 50. So these are the hemodynamic spares that we had because of the tumor handling that was repeatedly present in the carcinoid tumor. Not only this, the saturations, the ETCO2 had 52 and saturations had fallen as it was expected, but we were managing it. There were several episodic challenges, and the peak pressures had risen up to 42 centimeters. ETCO2 had risen. The auscultation revealed marked reduction of breath sounds, and mean arterial pressure had fallen. Because of the retraction of the vessels, they were compressing the complete ventilated lung. And also there were episodes of hypertension because of it. So on this note, we had to request the surgeon to stop the stimulus at multiple times, and rapid fluid administration was given, because we need to rule out 2 causes, whether it's because of the hypovolemia or just because of the spasmic condition that is happening. We can't just rely on that. But since we had beat-to-beat fluid monitoring because of the cardiac output, we were monitoring that, and we had to give octreotide, which is an endocrine cyanide, even intraoperatively.
Cyanide or peptide?
So it's called as endocrine cyanide. Its name is called as endocrine cyanide.
Peptide, no? Yes.
But
how many amino acids are there in GHRH? How many amino acids
30.
are there in this nucleotide, GHRH? How can you say cyanide this?
So its name, okay, so sorry. It's a name which is called as.
That is the endocrine.
No, sir, it is peptide.
It is chemically what you are saying is right. That is why it is written in a different color. It is within inverted comma there.
Then you write somatostatin. But why are you writing?
Okay, sir.
Analog, you write just like we write in GnRH, Lupride or Decapeptyl, something like that. नहीं तो nickname दो तो मेरे हिसाब से I don't know, maybe true, but then you give the trade name.
Sir, the
Writing, you tell Rajiv.
Sir, the word cyanide here is used to neutralize all the histamine and serotonin and vasoactive agents released by the neuroendocrine tumors at that time. So clinically, clinician use this word to emphasize that this octreotide is so much important as soon as the histamine is released.
Cyanide से ऐसा लगता है गौरव जैसे कोई poisoning
Yes,
कर रहा है.
yes. So this is what written in books. Yes,
That is the purpose.
Sir, that is the purpose.
So that is the purpose.
That is the purpose. That is the purpose of histamine, poisoning the histamine release.
Boluses of steroids were also given, and we avoided norepinephrine, which we routinely use because norepinephrine is supposed to stimulate the kallikrein release, which we are avoiding, and that would further precipitate hypertension and vasodilatation. Rather, boluses of phenylephrine were preferred. These are the serial ABGs that we encounter. During the hypoxia, the PSA2 was rising, but fortunately it had fallen down after 30 minutes of event, and the saturation had also come up. But there were episodes of desaturation that we were encountering, so we had to rule out whether it's because of the gradual desaturation that is expected in one lung in lateral positioning, or only because of the retraction of the major vessels that they are doing during the surgery, or it's because of the malposition of the right DLT, as I had told that the right DLT cuff can be displaced at lateral positioning during tumor handling also. So we did a fiber optic bronchoscope after increasing the FiO2 to 100%, and the tube was rechecked via fiber optic intraoperatively while pausing the surgeries, and confirmed that the ventilation of right upper lobe is there, and manually ventilated to recruit the lung, and proper tracheal and bronchial suctions were done, but the patient was kept in deep plane of anesthesia to prevent any triggers because of light plane. Fluid administration in this surgery is important because it's a pulmonary surgery and no fluids is given for the third space. Rather, if there is increased fluid in such lateral positioning, that can lead to gravity-dependent transudation in the dependent lung, and collapsed lung is more prone for edema. So we aim that the urine output should be 0.5 ml per kg per hour and not more than that. Prior to extubation, the patient in the lateral position is turned to supine. The adequates after suctioning, the double lumen tube is changed to the single lumen tube to adequately assess the compliance of the lung, and before extubation the top-up of epidural is given so that the patient wakes up pain-free. As we can see, the extubation time, the ABGs were much better. Hence, we achieved the extubation criteria of adequate oxygenation, ventilation, stable vitals, neurologically intact and awake patient. So we extubated the patient on table after reversal. We had stable hemodynamics, adequate urine output. Patient was not on any inotropic supports. The vitals were stable, pain score was good, recovery was good. Post-operative day 0, the ABGs were good. Patient was only on 2 liters of nasal throngs, and epidural boluses were given even in post-operative period, so that the patient has adequate coughing and secreting the secretions, taking out the secretions, and also the patient is not on any post-operative ventilator, so the risk of post-operative atelectasis because of pain is avoided. Now I invite the oncopathology resident to please share the HPR slides.
Thank you, ma'am. Very good morning to one and all. I am Dr. Aditya Mundra, and I will be discussing the pathological aspects of this particular case. We received left pneumonectomy specimen measuring 15 into 12 into 12.5 into 5 centimeters. Examination of the external surface, pleura was ruptured. Examination of the cut surface, we observed a tumor measuring 8 centimeter in the greatest dimension. The tumor was solid and homogeneous. Soft in consistency and grey brown in color.
स्पेसिफिक टर्म होती है जो न्यूरोएंडोक्राइन ट्यूमर्स के ग्रॉस एनाटॉमी के लिए बोली जाती है. तो देखते हो जैसे आपको पता लगता है कि इट इज ए न्यूरोएंडोक्राइन ट्यूमर.
Sir, solid, usually homogeneous consistency होती है ट्यूमर्स की.
Salt and pepper appearance.
माइक्रोस्कोप
On the surgery.
सर माइक्रोस्कोपी में वो देखते हैं.
Oh, just go to textbooks and see it.
माइक्रोस्कोपी में सर सॉल्ट एंड पेपर अपीयरेंस बोलते हैं. माइक्रोस्कोपी सर. सॉल्ट एंड पेपर क्रोमैटिन.
पढ़ के आया हूँ, बता रहा हूँ आपको. ठीक है ना? But it is on the gross appearance when the surgeon has opened the neuroendocrine tumor of the appendix. Maximum it is in the intestine followed by lung. All right?
I think the only thing you can
ovary also, Navar department.
Only thing you can say is that most adenocarcinomas, if they are so large, they will have areas of necrosis. They will have a variegated appearance, whereas these tumors usually have a homogeneous appearance. But surgical students, when you are shown a specimen in the exam, this is how you have to describe, not just make a diagnosis.
Examination of the external surface showed a ruptured pleura. Examination of the cut surface showed a tumor measuring 8 cm in the greatest dimension, solid and homogeneous, soft in consistency and grey-brown in color. Microscopic examinations, low power view of hematoxylin and eosin stained slides showed tumor cells arranged in nests which were separated by thin fibrous septae. This is known as organoid formations. Lymphovascular invasion was seen. As we can see a lymphovascular channel over here lined by endothelial cells with presence of tumor cells within the lumen. Perineural invasion was seen. As we can see a nerve bundle over here which is surrounded and othered by tumor cells. Visceral pleura was ruptured and invaded by tumor cells. As we can see the black ink over here which is representing the visceral pleura, and there is invasion of tumor cells seen over here. Spread through air spaces was noted. What do we understand by spread through air spaces? They are basically alveoli which are away from the tumor foci. They are normal alveoli, but there is presence of tumor cells within the cavity of the alveoli. So we can see normal alveoli with no tumor cells within, but an alveoli which is involved by tumor cells over here. Metastatic tumor deposits were noted in the lymph node. As we can see normal lymphatic tissue over here, and which is being replaced by the tumor cells. Bronchial cut-in was involved by the tumor. We can see hyaline cartilage over here of the bronchus and surrounding tumor cells. This is a high power view, hematoxylin and eosin stained slides high power view of the tumor, showing tumor cells which are round to oval in shape, have moderate amount of eosinophilic cytoplasm, round nucleus and a characteristic salt and pepper chromatin and inconspicuous nucleoli. So all the above mentioned features are of neuroendocrine tumor of the lung. So immunohistochemical examination was advised, which is as follows. The tumor cells showed diffuse cytoplasmic positivity for synaptophysin, which can be appreciated by the brown color. Growth hormone was negative. There was diffuse nuclear positivity for TTF1, and the Ki67 proliferation index was less than 3%. So summarizing our findings of histopathology and immunohistochemistry, a final impression of well-differentiated neuroendocrine tumor grade 1, which is also known as typical carcinoid, was given. The bronchial cut-in and the visceral pleura was involved by the tumor. 2/4 subcarinal lymph node showed metastatic tumor deposits, and a pathological stage of PT4N2 was given. According to the latest WHO classification of thoracic tumors, neuroendocrine tumors of the lung are classified into typical carcinoids, atypical carcinoids, large cell neuroendocrine carcinomas and small cell lung carcinomas. The characteristic features of typical carcinoids are that they are seen in females during the 6th decade of life, and the diagnostic criteria is that mitotic count will be less than 2 per 2 mm square field, necrosis will not be seen, neuroendocrine morphology, the organoid formation of tumor cells will be noted, the Ki67 proliferation index will not be more than 5%, TTF1 expression can and cannot be seen, P40 expression is usually negative, and these tumors are not associated with non-small cell lung carcinomas. Now I request Dr. Deepak from the Department of Surgical Oncology to further discuss the case.
On post-op day 0, sir, patient shifted to SICU with after extubation in stable vitals, Adequate analgesia was maintained. Observation of intercostal drainage to output, vitals, blood sugar level was taken. Endocrine opinion was taken to control the blood sugar levels and steroid dosage. On post-op day 1, we see the fluid level rising in the left hemithoracic cavity. We clamped the ICD on the same day and regained the high protein diet for the patient. Mobilization and cuffing was encouraged. Breathing exercise and spirometry has been started. On post-op day 3, we can see that there is rising level of fluid in left hemithorax. So we removed the ICD on post-op day 3. Patient was discharged from ward on post-op day 7 in consultation with the endocrine department. There are a long list of complications which may happen during or after pneumonectomy. Of these, none of the complication has been occurred in this patient. The bronchopleural fistula, which is the more morbid complication which can occur after any lung surgery, this has been not happened in this case, and of this we have used the intercostal muscle flap for covering the bronchial stump, left bronchial stump in this patient. Follow-up bronchoscopy was done, and which shows there is no any air leak on left main bronchus. Now I invite Dr. Ayush for further discussion.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Deepak. So, good morning, respected faculty and dear colleagues. The patient came to us post-operatively day 5 for an ophthalmic review. The right eye had a total ophthalmoplegia and the left eye had lateral movements restricted. Both of these things resolved on post-operative day 5. In addition to this, the ptosis reduced in severity. There was a mild ptosis which was resolving, and the exotropia reduced to 10 degrees. Also, the left eye proptosis also decreased. In addition to this, the left eye had a visual acuity and field improvement, while the right eye was the same. Post-operatively on day 90, the right eye had no ptosis, no exotropia, and there was no proptosis in the left eye. The pupils were round, regularly active in both the eyes, and visual acuity in the right eye improved significantly. Previously, the patient only had perception of light and perception of rays in both eyes, and now the patient could count up to 3 meters. So, subjectively, blind patient could now see. This was an impressive result. The left eye had 6/12 vision on pinhole. Here we have the patient's pre-operative fundus photographs in the upper half, and the post-operative day 90 fundus photographs in the lower half. The patient had diabetic retinopathy due to elevated blood glucose level due to the acromegaly, and post-operatively on day 90, due to the reduction in blood glucose levels, there is a significant decrease in flame-shaped hemorrhages, cortical spots, and other findings in general. Here we have the pre-operative versus the post-operative pre-operative baseline perimetry versus the post-operative day 90 perimetry. We can see significant visual field, nasal as well as temporal visual field improvements in the left eye, while the right eye had nasal field improvements, while the temporal fields were the same. Now I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Puneet to discuss the endocrine findings post-operatively. Thank you.
A very good morning to all the respected doctors. So on post-operative day 90, the patient got better. Her soft tissue changes due to acromegaly decreased. Her ptosis and headache resolved, and extraocular movements were normal. On hormonal profile, growth hormone levels declined significantly from 80 microgram per liter to 0.54 microgram per liter without any pituitary surgery. Her IGF levels also declined significantly from 588 nanogram per milliliter to 133 nanogram per milliliter, and prolactin levels also declined significantly. We also got her post-op MRI done, which was suggestive of a decrease in pituitary size. So on the left hand side we had the first MRI, and on the right hand side we have the post-pneumonectomy changes seen on the MRI.
1 minute, Doctor. What is the difference in acromegaly and gignetism? Gignetism, कुछ बोलो.
So whenever the growth hormone levels are significantly raised before the epiphyseal closure, it results into a gigantism, and if epiphyseal closure has already been taken, and after that if supposedly there is a pituitary adenoma or any pathology which is causing a very high levels of GH, also known as GH excess, then it results into acromegaly.
So what are the reversible and non-reversible changes?
Sir, usually...
How can you see such a good post-operative picture in
Yes,
this
sir.
patient?
So usually the soft tissue changes, which are usually because of the retention of sodium and water in the body, because of the growth hormone, they usually decrease, and the soft tissue changes decline and the decrease, and the patient improves. The weight also decreases when a patient gets operated, and in our patient also the diabetes mellitus also was in the remission. Her insulin and all the oral hypoglycemic agents also stopped because she had secondary diabetes mellitus because of acromegaly.
So this is an important aspect, because bony changes will be irreversible, but the soft tissue changes will be reversible. That is how you can see a very nice picture of this patient.
Yes, sir.
And pituitary adenoma is already resolved. The pressure on the optic chiasma and everything
Yes,
has gone.
sir. Yes, sir.
So this was a challenging case. We did have a predicted difficult laryngoscopy with one lung ventilation, the use of more difficult right DLT, spells of hemodynamic variability, swings of tumor handling, ensuring that there is no barotrauma, avoiding the risk of bronchopleural fistula, ensuring adequate ventilation in the solitary lung with increased peak pressures, maintaining core body temperatures for prolonged duration, and the challenge of on-table extubation, and avoiding post-operative positive ventilation. So we conclude that multidisciplinary approach has definitely helped effective patient management. This case was challenging and a great learning experience. The anesthesiologist as perioperative physician had a significant and crucial role in management, and adequate preoperative information about patients helps the anesthesiologist in best perioperative care. I sincerely thanks all the contributing departments who have helped in the management of this patient, and I thanks the Emeritus Swankar sir, Resident sir, Sardeva sir,